What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So if I've said it once, I'll say it a million more times. Samsung makes a lot of phones. Probably too many at this point for their own good. And look, I'm not a Samsung executive or a high-paid consultant. I'm just some dude who yaps in YouTube videos. But I feel like I have enough experience at this point, between all the phones I've reviewed and all the comments I read from you guys, to offer Samsung some suggestions. The reason I feel so compelled to help Samsung is because I like them. I like their phones. I like the fact that they have variety. They literally have a smartphone at every price point, from like $100 to $2,000. That's awesome. But some of their phones now, like this one especially, the S24 FE, it's just really a tough sell, and I have a hard time recommending it. Let me first say that there's arguably nothing wrong with the S24 FE this year. As a smartphone with no other comparisons to be made, this has everything you could want. A big, bright, high refresh rate screen, flagship specs powering the most up-to-date Android and One UI software experience packed with AI. The camera is far better than most people even need, let's be honest. And the price is, well, it's fine, again, if you have nothing else to compare it to, but that's the thing. The S24 FE isn't the only Samsung phone available. It isn't technically the only S-series phone. There's 3 others you could choose from. It isn't the cheapest phone Samsung sells either, not by a long shot. And its position within the lineup, a phone that's better than an A-series but lesser than a full-on S-series, means that spec for spec, it still makes more sense to just get the previous year's S-series flagship at a discount rather than getting this year's FE at full price. And what's sort of interesting is that Samsung agrees with that viewpoint too. They streamlined their US lineup this year by not launching the A55 in the States. And when asked why, they said basically that they want people buying this FE or last year's phones instead. They sell last year's phones at a discount on their website after all. What actually ended up happening though is that people didn't step up to the FE or even buy last year's phones. They just went down one more rung on the ladder and bought the A35 or the A15. Or they just kept their current phones for one more year, since really, smartphones haven't evolved much in the last 3 or 4 years, and that's something I'll talk about too. All rants aside, this is a review of the S24 FE first and foremost, and I'm going to get back to talking about this phone primarily. But the reason for my rant is that this phone doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's not the only Samsung phone. It's not the only mid-tier Android phone. So no matter how decent it is on its own, it has to be compared to the other options out there. And Samsung has to make some changes to make it a bit more appealing. But before we get into that, with winter here in full force, you're probably dreading dealing with increased heating costs and keeping every room in your house slightly above freezing. To help with that, I would recommend installing a Drio wall-mounted heater, this video's sponsor. This little guy is powerful enough to keep almost any room nice and warm. It's super easy to install, and it's super smart too. It's powered by a regular wall outlet and can easily be mounted using the included screws and guide for a quick installation. Once powered on, it can start heating instantly within 2 seconds, blowing a steady stream of warm air that you can direct by adjusting the vent 30 degrees up or down. The built-in display and buttons allow you to set the heating mode, fan speed, and more, but the Drio app is really the best way to control it. You'll see the room temperature, and you can switch between 5 different modes: eco, fan only, and 3 heating levels. With Eco mode, the heater can help yield you a 40% energy savings with precise temperature measurements and open window detection, where it powers off to conserve energy. Best of all, it's an incredibly safe heater, with 8 levels of protection. It won't overheat, it's fireproof and waterproof, wiring is insulated, and it even has a child lock. Drio is the top fan and heater brand in the US, and their new wall-mounted space heater is the portable, affordable, smart, and safe space heater that can keep you warm this winter. Click the link in the video description below to learn more, and use my discount code to buy one if you're interested. So from a design standpoint, one thing I often say is that with an A-series or an FE like this one, no one is going to know that you opted for the cheaper Samsung phone, the non-flagship one. All of Samsung phones, from the $100 one to the flagship ones, look the same, at least from the back. And this FE in particular doesn't get any cheaper of a build either. It's Gorilla Glass Victus Plus on the front and back, it's got an all-aluminum frame, feels like a premium $1,000 smartphone. From the front, however, well, the big 6.7-inch screen actually is more of a perk than you might think. I know a lot of phones are this big or bigger nowadays, but specifically looking at Samsung phones, The A series get the big screen size, but the S series, well, the regular S24 is smaller than this by a lot. The S24 Plus is more comparable size-wise, and I know there's way more with the S24 Plus than just its size, but if that's the only thing you cared about, you save a lot of dollars getting this big phone instead. The downside is that if you're particular about bezels, those black borders that frame the screen, this phone has a pretty thick border and lower screen-to-body ratio. Surprisingly, people seem to care a lot less about that than I thought. So maybe it's not a big deal at all. One thing that does irk me a little bit about the S24 FE is that you only get 128 gigabytes of storage on this phone, at least for the cheaper $650 price point. It's really not a lot by today's standards, and with no micro SD card and 30 or so gigs taken up by apps and the OS, you're kind of at the mercy of a cloud storage solution to some extent. Opting for the 256 gigabyte model of this phone at a smidge over $700, I think that doesn't make a ton of sense, to be honest. So my first outright suggestion to Samsung is this: just double the storage on the FE next year. You can afford it. When it comes to the display and the overall viewing experience, aside from the thick bezels, I really don't have anything else to complain about. The FE has a dynamic AMOLED 2X panel. It's a full HD 2340 by 1080 resolution. It's a 120Hz high refresh rate display. It's bright enough at 1900 nits. There's really nothing here that says cheap or budget or lesser when compared to even the flagship S series. At least nothing the average consumer is going to notice or miss. The problem is that I just don't know where Samsung goes from here. The A series phones this year, both the A35 and A55, well, they have just as good of a screen as this guy. The regular flagship S24 isn't that much better, and it isn't until you spend close to $1,000 or more on the S24 Plus or the Ultra that you actually get a better screen, a higher resolution one, a brighter one, perhaps better or newer OLED display technology. But again, the number of people who notice or appreciate that is probably pretty small. So what does Samsung do? They're kind of stalled out here with the FE, because if they make the screen on this phone any better, it's going to overlap with the S series. And the A series has basically caught up now. And like I said, I don't have any specific suggestions to make the screen better. I mean, could it be brighter? I guess. Does adding a QHD resolution option make sense? Maybe. Does going to 144 Hz matter? I don't think so. I mean, look, this is a great screen, don't get me wrong. I wish there were some things I could suggest, but this is where I just don't envy Samsung at all. It's a tough position to be in, and I think rather than trying to change the FE, they should just make this an easier buy with fewer competitive smartphones in their own lineup. So when Samsung decided to use their own Exynos chip inside the FE this year, I think there were a lot of knee-jerk reactions from people who have sworn off Exynos forever, saying that this was a mistake. And look, if you've had a bad experience with previous Exynos chips, I don't blame you for wanting to avoid them still. I also fully agree that using an Exynos chip, regardless of the fact that this is a new higher tier chip, kind of lessens the value of the FE in some way. I mean, the S20 FE, the original phone in this series, its big selling point was the fact that it had the same flagship Snapdragon processor as the actual flagship S20. So yeah, this S24 FE probably should have gotten the Snapdragon 8 series just to keep things consistent and make everyone happy. But there's three counterpoints I'll try and make in support of Samsung here. First and foremost, this chip really isn't bad at all. In fact, in my experience, I haven't had any issues with performance or overheating, even running some of the games that I play at settings that probably aren't necessary. But hey, the phone and the processor can do it, the developer offers it, so you may as well try and take advantage of it. I really don't think the Exynos 2400E in this phone has any of the issues that previous Exynos chips have had, and it seems like a lot of other people are seeing that too. This is a processor that is flagship caliber, and it's hard to convince me otherwise, and probably harder still to convince almost anyone else these days. The second thing I'll say is that Samsung is probably battling some higher costs with the top-end Snapdragon chips right now. And so in order to keep this phone cheap or cheaper, they probably can't put the higher tier, most expensive smartphone processor in a phone that isn't their flagship device. I obviously don't know the cost to make a smartphone nowadays, but I'm giving Samsung the benefit of the doubt here. If using their own Exynos chip keeps this phone a few $100s cheaper, then fine, so be it. And last but not least, whether the Exynos chip is good, bad, or completely irrelevant, Samsung is still putting money behind developing it. It's in their roadmap. That's probably 2 or 3 or 4 years out at any given time. So while we all might complain about the Exynos chip now, Samsung might have already had this one in development a few years ago, and it was too late to do any drastic product changes or attempt to revitalize the Exynos name. In the future, I guess we'll see if Exynos will remain an in-house chip that Samsung uses on their own devices. I mean, I can see it with their low-end and mid-tier phones, but I think a lot of everyday consumers are maybe starting to prefer the name brand stuff. They're more familiar with tech companies, they're more familiar with the names like Snapdragon, they know what devices might have those chips inside, and I just don't think Samsung is like a pioneer in chip technology right now, at least not mobile processors versus Snapdragon, but I guess we'll see what happens. Looking ahead and considering some rumors I've seen for the next gen Snapdragon chips being even more expensive, I actually don't think the next FE, if there is one, will get the latest Snapdragon either, but I guess we'll see what happens. Perhaps there's a Snapdragon processor that's like 90% as good, that's still affordable, that Samsung might use instead. One sort of odd thing about the S24 FE is that inside, this phone has a 4700 mAh battery, which on its own has actually been totally fine for my purposes. It's easily an all-day phone. I've maxed out at around 11 hours of screen on time, but I'm usually pulling 8 or 9 hours with ease. It's just that this is such a big phone, and so many other Samsung devices have 5000 mAh batteries, and they've all had 5000 mAh batteries now for so long with no outright increase in capacity. I feel like even a 5500 or 6000 mAh battery would make this phone really stand out. And I don't know why Samsung and many of the other major smartphone companies are so afraid of going bigger. Also, the 25-watt wired charging and 15-watt wireless, that's fine, I guess, but similar to the battery size, Samsung seems to no longer be a leader in charging speeds. I realize half the population still uses a 5-watt USB-A charger with half the stuff they own, but still, if there's something that can easily be improved with not just the FE, but with all Samsung phones right now, it's bigger batteries and faster charging speeds. Last but not least, I want to just briefly touch on the camera with the S24 FE. I've done a few comparisons already with this phone, the A series and the S series, and I know Samsung is going to continue to reserve all its high-end flagship features and lenses for the top flagship phones, especially the Ultra. And while this phone is better than the A series for sure, even though honestly the A series cameras this year are pretty darn good, I don't think Samsung is ever going to say that the FE has the same camera setup as the flagship. They have to reserve that stuff for their flagship phones now and for forever probably, since that's really what Samsung and Apple and plenty of other companies are focusing all their attention on anyway, at least during the last few years of smartphones, all that camera stuff. And more than anything else, I think if you're all in on photography or filmmaking or utilizing every single camera feature on your smartphone for whatever it is that you do, you're going to be opting for an Ultra or an iPhone Pro or a Pixel Pro, something that's entirely 100% camera focused. For this FE, the camera is great. It's nearly flagship caliber, and it has stuff like 8K video recording that 99.9% of FE owners will literally never use. Mostly, people are just going to appreciate that this phone takes a good picture. A better picture, for sure, than any budget or mid-tier phone they would otherwise purchase or might be familiar with. And this certainly separates the FE from the cheaper A-series phones if you needed any other reason to go this route. So where does Samsung go from here? Well, here's my suggestion. Samsung should have 4 or 5 phones in their lineup, and that's it. A cheap option like the A15, an actual mid-tier option like the A35, and then the FE and the regular S flagship should probably merge, so you end up with an entry-level S-series phone, and then an Ultra S-series phone. There doesn't need to be an FE and a small regular flagship and a Plus and an Ultra and 3 or 4 A-series phones on top of all that. It's just too many. And given the choice, people I think are either just going for the cheaper option, whatever it is, or they already are set on the most expensive option. This muffled middle ground of phones that Samsung is stuck with right now is doing them no favors, and the FE feels like it's suffering because of it, even though it's a perfectly good phone on its own. But what do you guys think Samsung should do? Would you buy an FE under any circumstances right now? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.